Sony ZV-1 Mark II is the predecessor to Sony ZV-1. I have owned the Sony ZV-1 since it was first launched. I actually sold it per this recording yesterday because I bought another camera instead. We're going to talk about this later in this video, but I'm going to try to convince you why the Sony ZV-1 Mark I is better than the Sony ZV-1 Mark II. Because yes, there is some new features added to the Sony ZV-1 Mark II that we've all been waiting for. There's a slightly wider lens from the 24 to 70mm on the ZV-1 to the 18 to 50 on the ZV-1 Mark II. But as far as I can say, all of those who have had the camera in for a test, I don't have it yet because I'm not in the Sony program, so I don't get all the test cameras in order to test the products before release. The lens is not stabilized in the 18mm to 50mm in the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, but the lens is slightly just optical stabilized in the Sony ZV-1 Mark I. This means that when you activate the active stabilization, it crops in a bit further than the Sony ZV-1 does. At least that's what it looks like when I'm seeing all the videos online. I tell you what, on the Sony ZV-1, the Mark I, you can get a lens adapter to put on the lens to make it even wider. And I think that is a better solution than just getting the Sony ZV-1 Mark II. It's a problem that has been discussed also in the ZV-1F, the wider angle no zoom lens that's also so super much cheaper than the Sony ZV-1 Mark II. That it's slightly more wobbly when you're walking around with the camera, and the camera is designed for vlogging, like going around with the camera, and I don't see that the camera can do the job good enough. There's one thing on the Sony ZV-1 and the Sony ZV-1 Mark II and the Sony ZV-1F and this other camera right here that's just really great for vlogging, and the thing is that you don't need a microphone because the built-in microphone in these cameras is just so good. But there's no reason to upgrade to the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, or there's no reason even to purchase the Sony ZV-1 Mark II if you're looking for it, because right now I'm guessing that the Sony ZV-1 is going to drop in price, and maybe even you can get it used for a great price if you actually want the built-in lens. But my recommendation is to don't buy any of these cameras, because this one because I sold my ZV-1 and I got this one instead. This is the Sony ZV-E10, so all the naming is getting more and more confused. And I have had the Sony ZV-1 for so long. This is roughly the same size, or yes, it's much more heavier than the Sony ZV-1, but it's roughly the same size. And it can actually fit in a pocket, maybe a bigger pocket, but it can be in a pocket. And for this camera, it's cheaper than the Sony ZV-1 and the ZV-1 Mark II, and it has one thing that they don't have, because this camera will be good enough for so long because you can switch out the lenses. And then you're probably going to say, if I put on a big lens like this, then it cannot fit in my pocket anymore. No, that's right. But there are lens options out there that are pancake sized. I even think that this comes with a kit lens that's so tiny. If you put a tiny pancake sized lens on this with a fast aperture of maybe 1.8 or about 2.0, you'll get so much better camera quality out of this than you get on the Sony ZV-1. The Sony ZV-1's biggest flaw, which also the same as the biggest flaw on the same Sony ZV-1 Mark II, is there's no reason to buy the camera if you have a proper smartphone. The built-in stabilization in the smartphone, especially the newer models of the iPhone, and the built-in camera quality of the newer models smartphone is better. There's a 1-inch sensor in the newest iPhones. I think it's the Pro version you need to have to get the 1-inch sensor, but that's the same sensor size that is on the Sony cameras. There's better built-in software in the phones that makes the image quality even better because they make slight adjustments. So if you're vlogging, going around and want to film travel videos and want to film videos with a small footprint, something you can put in your pocket, then there's no reason for Sony ZV-1 even to exist when you have a good smartphone. Close to $1,000 you need to pay to get the Sony ZV-1 or the ZV-1 Mark II. That's a great upgrade for a phone instead. And you know what? The camera I'm recommending you to buy instead is even cheaper. This is about $600, whereas the Sony ZV-1 and the ZV-1 Mark II is about $1,000. And this has an APS-C sized sensor. I don't know how the exact conversion is, but I think this is maybe 50% larger sensor size than there is in the Sony camera, Sony ZV-1 camera, and then there's on the smartphones. And you need a larger sensor if you want to pull away from what you can get in the smartphones. The computational photography that's built into the iPhones is just so far beyond what Sony can do in their computational photography. So what you want in your camera when you're buying a camera is something that you cannot do artificially, and that is the sensor size, the image quality. The larger the sensor is from the APS-C size, which is much larger than the 1-inch, and the full frame sensor that is 50% larger even than the APS-C, you get in much more light, which means that you can have much higher quality videos and photos in lower light, but it also means that you can have a much faster release time. So if you're taking photos, you can have much faster shutter time, which means oftentimes it gets so much more sharper images. And it also means at a higher f-stop, maybe f2.8 would be roughly the same that an f1.8 would be on an APS-C camera if you compare a full frame camera to an APS-C camera. And this means you get that blurry background, and you see as a little bit off in my image here, but that's something that people are looking to achieve when they're buying a camera, because that's something the smartphones cannot do yet. Yes, I know the iPhone has this fake blurry background, but if you see that just on a slightly bigger screen, you know it looks, it doesn't look that good. There is two things that the Sony ZV-1 Mark II does better than the Sony ZV-1. It is that they learned from their mistake. In the Sony ZV-1, they had the gate for the battery and the SD card open in the wrong place. So when you mounted a tripod handle or a selfie arm, you couldn't get to the SD card or the battery, so you had to dismount it all the time. But that can be fixed on the Sony ZV-1 Mark I with just a base plate, and then you can move the, I think it's called a 1/4 inch, a 1/4 thread, so you can put on your tripod or your selfie stick or something else and still get to the battery. The other thing is, and I haven't tested it, but they say that there's an even better built-in microphone that there's on these ZV-1 and the ZV-E10 and the ZV-E1, etc. But the built-in microphone in these cameras, the ZV-E10 and the ZV-1, is good enough. I tell you, if you take this audio and put it into something like Adobe Podcast and use AI to enhance the audio, it's good enough. It's actually almost as good as my audio coming out of this $1,000 setup with audio interfaces and expensive microphones and so on and so on. And there's one tiny thing more than in the ZV-1 Mark II, there is this new mode I really love that's called the CINEVLOG mode. I actually thought that it was in the Sony ZV-E10 as well. I'm hoping it's coming to my camera with a firmware update, but if it's not coming, I'm just going to have to do this in post. It's a very cool thing if you are not like super camera savvy and you want to make something that looks much more cinematic. It's a new feature that was introduced in the Sony ZV-E1, and it's now also available in the Sony ZV-1 Mark II. It's a feature I really love. If you want a tiny camera that you're going to vlog with and you don't want to vlog with your phone, really consider the Sony ZV-E10. But if you want a built-in lens and still doesn't want to vlog with your phone instead of a camera, because I really think you should put the $1,000 in your phone upgrade instead, then consider the Sony ZV-1 instead of the Sony ZV-1 Mark II. I'm guessing that on Facebook Marketplace, some are going to sell their Sony ZV-1 instead of the Sony ZV-1 Mark II. So maybe you can make a good deal right now and get this for 50% off, $500 instead of $1,000. But this is only $600 from brand new. So really consider this instead. My thing is that if you want a camera and you really want to shoot something with a camera instead of a phone, then you need a larger sensor, a sensor that's not available in phones. And another thing is, if you want a super stabilized vlogging setup for when you're traveling, you should maybe consider a GoPro instead of a phone or the Sony ZV-1. The GoPro is also like maybe 50% of the Sony ZV-1, and that is just super steady, and you can bring it into water and everything, and you can really have this in your pocket if you're going around. And the vlogging, the wide angle lens on the GoPro, it's much better. I know on a GoPro you might need some microphone setup, but I'm sure there is microphones available available out there, tiny footprint microphone, then you can make it good enough for vlogging. Maybe even if you use the Adobe Podcast Enhance software on the GoPro, it will be good enough. And if you want to learn how to do this, in this video right here, I'm going to put it on my screen, you can see how I enhance the audio from just built-in microphone on the camera to be good enough for everything that you're going to do online.